Thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for joining for my talk today. I'd say I got a little sore throat today. One of the perks of having small kids at home, so my voice might go in and out, but I got some water by my side, and I will try to talk for 2 hours and not pass out. So yeah, atrazine. Atrazine is one of the most widespread pesticide water contaminants in the US. In fact, it is the most. And it's really a really good example of why our country is falling so far behind in pesticide regulation compared with much of the rest of the world. So as Michael said, I'm a scientist at the Center for Biological Diversity, and my work focuses on pesticide regulation and policy. So hopefully I can share some wisdom with you all today and not thoroughly depress you. So just this will be kind of a longer talk than I'm used to giving. So I just want to give an outline of where I'm going to be meandering the next hour or two. I want to start on focusing, big picture, pesticide regulation in the US. How did we go from being the gold standard in the 70s, which we very much were, to where we are now, which is falling behind and lagging a lot of other places around the world when it comes to protecting our citizens from harmful pesticide exposure. And one of the ways that I've gone about doing that is looking at how do we measure up to other countries around the world, not just any other country. How do we measure up to other countries that have an enormous agricultural economy like we do, which is really the best basis for comparison. And I think you'll see some things that thoroughly surprise many people. And then our failings our failings in regulating pesticides doesn't affect everyone equally. There's no winners by any means. All of us are exposed to some extent, but there are very much losers in this game. And it's not like everyone's getting hit all the same. Certain communities are getting hit hardest. And it's important to acknowledge that as we figure out how to properly fix things moving forward. And then I'm going to hit on some emerging concerns that we're noticing cropping up in the pesticide space that I think is bringing us full circle, really, in a lot of ways, back to the DDT days. I don't think we'll ever get that bad, but we're seeing some very concerning things happening with pesticide persistence in the past few years. And I think it's going to be something that we really need to focus on quite a bit. Then I want to jump into, kind of a more specific area. So going from broad down to targeted, and looking at atrazine in particular, and why atrazine has become untouchable. It has just about the best case you could have of banning a pesticide, and yet we still use just about as much as we did in the 60s and 70s. Use hasn't come down. Harm is still incredibly high from this pesticide, and why that is. So I'm just going to touch on what is atrazine, give it an introduction, where we find it, what are the harms from atrazine, and in this time of misinformation that we all live in, there's a lot of really good data out there on atrazine, and there is a lot of misinformation too. So I want to wade through that and discuss it in this space. And also want to talk about who makes atrazine and what have they done to make it untouchable. And then we actually happen to be in a time of flux right now in atrazine, and it's a very good time to make some significant changes. So after I've thoroughly depressed you with sections 1 and 2, I will hopefully bring your hopes back up on the last section here, and hopefully we can make some progress moving forward, because I think there is the opportunity to do that here. So how do we, the US, measure up to our agricultural peers? So we use more than 85 pesticides that are banned in either the European Union, China, or Brazil. So if you look at this, let me get my laser pointer here. Yeah. So if you look at this graph here, you can see on the y-axis, you've got the number of pesticides that are approved here in the US. And then on the X here, you have the pesticides that are banned or being phased out in the European Union, Brazil, China, at least one of those places, at least two of those places, and then the two pesticides, the toxic two, I'll call them, that are banned in all three. So we use in the US, at the time I published this like 6 years ago, 72 pesticides that are banned in the European Union, quite a bit. That number is well above 80 right now. I stopped keeping track after a while, but the EU is still progressing while we are flatlining. We also use 17 pesticides banned in Brazil. Then, at generally very high levels, 11 pesticides banned in China. And then 85 banned in at least one of those places, 13 banned in at least two. And then the two here that are banned in all three that we use in the US are paraquat, which is one of the most acutely lethal pesticides ever made. A single thimbleful is enough to kill a full-grown adult, and there's no known antidote. It's used as a suicide agent, unfortunately, throughout the world. And then phorate is the other one. It's an organophosphate pesticide, incredibly neurotoxic, just absolutely disgusting stuff that we really have no business using in this country or anywhere in the world, really. So it's not like these pesticides are just, random pesticides that we use, maybe a couple 100 pounds of each year. These are widely used pesticides. 10 of the most 25 widely used pesticides in the US are banned in at least one of these places. These are things like paraquat. We use 14 million pounds each year here in the US. Atrazine, we use 70 million pounds here in the US. So it's not like these are just random weird pesticides we don't use that much of. We use a ton of them. And if you look down here, you can just see the sheer volume. So we use 322 million pounds of pesticides each year that are banned in the European Union. That is a full quarter of all our total pesticide use in the US is of pesticides banned in the European Union. Absolutely unacceptable. And even China, China and Brazil are not exactly the countries you think to be racing past us and protecting their citizens, but they are. Look, we use 40 million pounds of pesticides each year in the US that China has said is just too dangerous to use within their borders. 26 million pounds of pesticides that Brazil has protected their citizens from that we haven't. So, these volumes are enormous. It's hard to even grasp what 322 million pounds even is. It's just the sheer enormity is outrageous. And a lot of detractors like to say, oh, European Union, they're banning all these things, they're destroying their agricultural sector. And it's not true. If you look at agricultural land, the European Union has less agricultural land than just China. And yet, if you look at the export value of its agricultural products, it's higher than the US, China, and Brazil combined. So the European Union has maintained a thriving agricultural economy, and at the same time protecting their citizens from very harmful things that are used in agriculture. So it's just really hits home that we're falling quite far behind, and we need to step it up big time. So why is this? Why do we use so many pesticides that the rest of the world is saying, no way, this is crazy? Well, part of it has to do with how we cancel pesticides or how we ban pesticides, because our laws make it very difficult to do that. Many of the significant actions that EPA has taken happened, in the 70s when the office was formed, in part due to the outcry after people started reading Silent Spring and the amazing work that Rachel Carson did. EPA had a mandate. They had a new law that came into place, and they were kicking butt. They were getting rid of DDT and aldrin and chloridane and all these just really nasty things that should never have been in use. And that is evident in this graph here. So this table here is just has the numbers that are reflected in this graph. So just focus on this graph here. On the y-axis, you've got the number of pesticides that have been canceled in the United States. And then on the X here, you have 5 different decades, right, from the 70s onward. The blue line here denotes non-voluntary cancellations. So that's basically like when the EPA comes in and says, this pesticide is too dangerous, we're not going to allow its use here. It's kind of similar to a ban, although we don't technically ban pesticides in the US. But the blue line you can think of more or less as a ban based off of harms to humans or the environment. So that's a non-voluntary cancellation. A voluntary cancellation is when the pesticide company comes to EPA and says, hey, listen, we don't want to sell this pesticide in the US anymore, so we need to cancel the registration. Now, why would a pesticide company do that? There's a few reasons. One is that there's a pesticide out there that maybe is getting a lot of very negative news coverage, and that company wants to distance themselves from that pesticide for public relations purposes. But the main reason that happens is because companies are required to pay annual registration fees to keep pesticides approved in the US. And this adds up over time. This could add up to $500,000 a year for a certain pesticide, depending on how many products are approved. So if the company is not making a lot of money off that pesticide, those registration fees don't really make economic sense to them, and they make an economic decision to stop selling a pesticide and canceling the registration in the US. So the blue line really denotes cancellations that are based off of human health or environmental harms, and red cancellations are generally because the pesticide's not selling that well. Either it's obsolete or there's a competitor product that is overtaking the market. And you can see in the 70s, the blue line was above the red line. EPA was canceling stuff. DDT, we're getting rid of it. And that blue line has gone down slowly to the point where it doesn't really exist anymore. I think there was one pesticide canceled in the 2010s. There's probably one, maybe 2 so far in the 2020s, but it's low. The EPA doesn't unilaterally cancel pesticides anymore. And they're pretty much reliant on the pesticide companies coming in and saying, we want to get rid of this. So you have bans that were going in place, earlier in the last 50 years that were based off of human health harms. Now, pesticide cancellations are generally based off of economic considerations and not necessarily what's most dangerous to people. So we're reliant on the pesticide companies to get rid of their own products, which is really quite sad. And it leads to a lot of dangerous products staying on the market. And similar to EPA's hands-off approach to canceling pesticides, we see, a lot of concerning things when it comes to approving new pesticides, because pesticides are constantly approved. Just this month, there will probably be another pesticide approved. It just keeps happening. And so what I did in 2017 and 2018 was I put in a public records request to say, okay, what's the approval rate, right? How many times is EPA saying, no, that's too dangerous, it's rejected? We found the approval rate, this is approvals of new pesticides, is incredibly high, 94%. So 94% of the time, a pesticide company comes to EPA and says, we want to register this product. EPA is saying, okay, go for it. And the other 6% of the time, all the rejections we found were due to procedural issues. So basically, the pesticide company didn't fill out their application correctly, and it got denied. So there's not one example we found in these 2 years where EPA rejected an application for a new pesticide based off of human health harms or environmental harms or anything. So, you know, everything goes, which is really worrisome. And it's not like all the pesticides that came in place in those 2 years were safe. We actually looked at individual products and found that, you know, there were 44 products containing neonicotinoids. These are widely implicated in pollinator die-offs throughout the world, and starting to become tied to neurological harms in children. There were 38 products containing glyphosate approved in those 2 years. Of course, tied to certain cancers like non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Dicamba 2,4-D, these are two herbicides that are starting to replace glyphosate to some extent, really nasty things. There were 15 products that contained organophosphates. These are some of the most neurotoxic chemicals that we know about. And these were approved just 6 or 7 years ago. 17 products containing atrazine, 6 containing paraquat, 4 containing fumigants like chloropicrin and methyl bromide. Methyl bromide was supposed to be phased out completely because it's an ozone depleter, and you know, should go away just from us signing and ratifying the Montreal Protocol. But we've got some loopholes in place that allow methyl bromide to still be used, unfortunately. 91 products in these 2 years are restricted use pesticides. These are pesticides where you need to have a license in order to apply. And 69 pesticides that the EPA itself has found are either a known or likely carcinogen. So that doesn't even include things like glyphosate, where IARC, the World Health Organization, has said, you know, glyphosate is tied to cancer, yet the EPA has come to the opposite conclusion. These are 69 ingredients that the EPA itself identifies as carcinogens. And 69 products containing those ingredients were approved in this last 2 years. And again, we basically got 100% approval rate because all the rejections were just because of incompetence in filling out an application. So very worrisome. I like highlighting this example here because it really shows how bad things have gotten. Aldicarb, which is probably a pesticide very few people have ever heard of, and that's a good thing. But it's one of the nastiest ever made. It was essentially banned in the US in 2010, but has since, you know, been re-registered for a few smaller uses, like you can still use it on peanuts and a few other crops. So it's still allowed to be used here, unfortunately. Thankfully, the use is generally pretty low. But it is responsible for one of the largest known outbreaks of foodborne pesticide illness ever to occur in North America. In the 1980s, some farmers applied it to watermelons in a manner that was not allowed. And it ended up sickening over 1,000 people. It was tied to the death of 6 people and 2 late-term miscarriages. So, and that's probably a gross underestimate of the harm that happened. So it gives you a sense of just how toxic this stuff is. I mean, imagine going into the grocery store, buying a watermelon, going home, eating it, and dying. I mean, that happened like 40 years ago. And thankfully, things have gotten better since then, but just a really terrible time in our history. It's considered one of the most acutely toxic pesticides ever used. It's banned in 125 countries. I mean, imagine getting 10 countries to agree on anything, and good luck with that, you know. But 125 countries, there's like not even 200 countries in the world. So it's like 60% of all the countries in the world have said, no, too toxic, you know, we don't want it here. It's listed on the Rotterdam Convention, and it's considered extremely hazardous by the World Health Organization, one of only about a dozen pesticides that actually make that high on the list. At the end of the first Trump administration, Aldicarb was given new life in the US. It was approved on oranges and grapefruits in Florida, and they allowed up to 2.5 million pounds of Aldicarb to be used on about 100,000 acres of orange and grapefruit groves in Florida. We sued them and got the decision reversed, thankfully. But nothing is off limits. And now we're in the second Trump administration, and I would not be surprised if it came rearing back, because we know through FOIA that an application is on EPA's desk right now to reapprove that same approval that the courts fought back. So if Aldicarb can get reapproved and have an expanded approval in the US, as recently as 2021, anything's on the table. So it's a scary time, and any progress needs to be fought tooth and nail to maintain in perpetuity, which is so frustrating, because we keep making progress and then backsliding with an administration that prioritizes industry over people. So who's getting hit? Who's shouldering the burden from our failure to adequately regulate pesticides? Well, I don't think this surprises anyone, but reducing your exposure to pollutants is a privilege, unfortunately. It's not a right, as it should be. So what that means is vulnerable communities are typically taking the hit. In California, this still surprises the hell out of me, but if someone wanted to guess, basically the color of your skin, based only on on your proximity to a harmful pollutant, knowing your exposure to pesticides would give them the highest likelihood of success. So what that means is, of all the pollutants assessed in California, pesticide exposure has the greatest disparity between whites and people of color. More so than particulate matter, more so than smog, traffic pollution, water pollution, proximity to hazardous waste sites. Pesticides is the pollutant that has the greatest disparity between whites and people of color in California. I don't know if that would hold for other states, but it's striking, and it's just absolutely crazy to me that is the case. But that's not to say that white people don't have pesticides in their bodies. Everyone does. I don't care what you eat, what you drink, where you live. Every single person has pesticides in their blood or urine right now. It's just the collateral damage we're living with to be in an industrial society, unfortunately. And so there's nothing you can do about having an exposure, because it's happening. But what we're talking about, the privilege we're talking about here, is controlling the extent of your exposures. And that's really, the most important thing, because the extent of your exposures is really the major correlation with disease and loss of quality of life. There's some exceptions, of course, with endocrine disruptors. Sometimes lower exposures can be more harmful than higher exposures, but for the vast majority of chemical exposures, it's really, the more you're exposed to, the more likely you are to have harm from your exposures. So when we're talking about the privilege to reduce your exposures, we're talking about the privilege to avoid pollutant-induced death and chronic disease and things that reduce your quality of life, which is sacred to everyone. So it's something that really needs to be talked about. And where do these disproportionate impacts come from? They come from all sorts of places. I mean, you could even look at access or ability to afford organic food. I mean, organic food is more expensive. There's some exceptions for some crops, but on the whole, organic is more expensive. It just is. And it requires a little more labor, it requires a little more care, and that leads to higher prices. It requires getting certified, which is an expensive process. And if you're living paycheck to paycheck, the thought of spending more on your grocery bill is not attainable for a lot of people. And even if you want to buy organic food, a lot of people don't have any organic options near them. You know, some people have to drive 50 miles just to find a grocery store that has an organic option available. So, you know, being able to reduce your exposure through diet can be very different among populations of people. Pesticide production too, you know, aside from some organic pesticides, you know, most pesticides are synthetic chemicals that need to be synthesized in a lab or a manufacturing facility. So what we did with this study was we looked at, there were 31 facilities around the country that produce pesticides that were in violation of our bedrock environmental laws, like the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act. So these are the 31 facilities that produce pesticides that we expected to be having the most harm to nearby communities that lived near the facility. So we looked at the demographics, a 1 mile, you know, radius from the facility, and then demographics of the national average, and then the relevant state averages. We found that for the average of all these 31 facilities, there were about 37% people who identified as BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, or a person of color. The national average is actually a little higher, which surprised us a bit at 40%. And then the relevant state average was about 6 points below that of the people who are close to the facility at 31%. When you look at percent low income, so this is the percent of people who make incomes that are twice as high as the federal poverty line. You see about 44% of people near these facilities as having low incomes, compared with 28 and 29% national and state averages. So you've got a much higher proportion of people who have lower incomes living near these facilities. And when you look regionally, so if you look at just the facilities that exist in California and you know, mainly southern states, you see there's a 63% population of people of color around these facilities, compared to a 40 and 38% national and state average. So, you know, the harms for pesticide manufacturing and the pollution produced are really hitting low-income people across the board, and regionally in certain states are more, you know, likely to disproportionately impact people of color. And then if you look at pesticide use, you know, the two bins we generally look at are agricultural pesticide use, which is by far the main one, and then residential pesticide use, so pesticides that people use in and around where they live. And it's no surprise that there's disproportionate exposures occupationally, given how segregated our agricultural labor workforce is. It's mostly migrant labor now from Mexico and Central America. The residential pesticide use, indoor exposures, so finding pests like cockroaches and rats and ants, and these things you definitely want to keep out of your homes. This often happens in structures that have a lot of people packed into a small space, and places that lack economic investment. So, you know, one of the major places to get hit by residential pesticide use and the exposures there are places like low-income public housing. And this reflects in people's exposure to pesticides, because if you look at, these are data from CDC's NHANES data set. So this is a nationally representative population that's tested for chemicals in their urine and blood. The CDC runs this. It's a great program. And so if you look at levels of pesticides in urine and blood, the NHANES data set identified about 14 or so pesticides. There are many, many more, but 14 or so that we were able to look at in our analysis. And almost 60% of those 14 pesticides had higher levels in blood and urine in Mexican Americans than the total population. About 70% of those pesticides had higher levels in blood and urine in blacks than the total population, and then only about 20% had higher levels in whites than the total population. So you see this disparity in pesticide exposure among different racial and ethnic classes. And so, historically, the CDC's data set only tracked these three demographic groups. It's better now. I think there's about 10 or so demographic groups it looks at, but since we were reliant on the historical data, we could only look at differences in these three groups. So just want to go through this a little bit more. The Worker Protection Standard is the main regulation governing protections from occupational pesticide exposure.